The Cay by Theodore Taylor. Chapter 1. Like silent, hungry sharks that swim in the darkness of the sea, the German submarines arrived in the middle of the night. I was asleep on the second floor of our narrow-gabled greenhouse in Willemstad, on the island of Caraco, the largest of the Dutch islands, just off the coast of Venezuela. I remember that on that moonless night on February 1942, they attacked the big Lago oil refinery in Aruba, the sister island west of us. Then they blew up 6 of our small lake tankers, the tubby ones that still bring crude oil from Lake Maracaibo to the refinery. Caracos Petroleum and Mitsubishi to be made into gasoline, kerosene, and diesel oil. One German sub was even sighted off Willemstad at dawn, so when I woke up, there was much excitement in the city, which looks like a part of old Holland, except that all the houses are painted in soft colors, pinks and greens and blues, and there are no dikes. It was very hard to finish my breakfast because I wanted to go to Punda, the business district, the oldest part of town, and then to Fort Amsterdam, where I could look out at the sea. If there was an enemy U-boat out there, I wanted to see it, and I wanted to join the people shaking a fist at it. I was not frightened, just terribly excited. War was something I'd heard a lot about, but I'd never seen. The whole world was at war, and now it had come to us in the warm blue Caribbean. The first thing that my mother said was, "Philip, the enemy has finally attacked the island, and there will be no school today, but you must stay near home. Do you understand me?" I nodded, but I couldn't imagine that a shell from an enemy submarine would pick me out of all the buildings, or hit me if I was standing on the famous pontoon bridge among the ships way back in the shot gate along St. Anna's Bay. So later in the morning, when she was busy making dinner, making sure all the blackout curtains were in place, and filling extra pots with fresh water and checking our food supply, I stole away to Fort with Henrik van Boven, my Dutch friend who was also 11. I played there many times with Henrik and the other boys who were a few years younger, imagining that we were defending Willemstad against the pirates or even the British. They once stormed the island, I knew long ago. Or sometimes we pretend that we were the Dutch going out on raids against the Spanish galleons. That had happened too. It was also real, and sometimes we could see the tall-masted ships coming over the horizon. Of course, they were only tattered-sailed native schooners from Venezuela, Aruba, or Bonaire, coming with bananas and oranges and papayas and melons and vegetables. But to us, they were always pirates, and we'd shout to the noisy black men aboard, and they'd laugh and go, "Pow, pow, pow," back at us. The fort looks as though it came out of a storybook, with guns and ports along the high walls that face the sea. For years it guarded Willemstad, but for the one morning it did not look like a storybook fort at all. There were real soldiers, real rifles. We saw machine guns. Men with binoculars had them trained toward the Whitecaps, and everybody was tense. They chased us away, telling us to go home. Instead, we went down to the Koningen Emma Brug, the famous Queen Emma pontoon bridge, which spans a channel that leads to the huge harbor, the Shot Gate. The bridge was built on floats so that it can swing open when ships pass in or out, and it connects to Punda with Ostrobanda, which means the other side, the other part of the city. The view from there wasn't as good as it was from the fort. Curious people were there too, just looking. Strangely, no ships were moving in the channel. The veer boats, the ferry boats that shuttled cars and people back and forth, were on the bridge when it was swung open. They were tied up and empty. Even the native schooners were quiet against the docks inside the channel, and the black men were not laughing and shouting the way they usually did. Henrik said, "My father told me that there's nothing left in Aruba. They hit St. Nicholas, you know." "Every lake tanker was sunk," I said. I don't know if that was true or not, but Henrik had an irritating way of sounding official since his father was connected with the government. His face was round and he was chubby. His hair was straw-colored and his cheeks were always red. Henrik was very serious about everything he said, and he did. And he looked towards Fort Amsterdam. He said, "I bet they put big guns up there now." That would be a safe bet. And I said, "It won't be long until the Navy is here." Henrik looked at me. "Our Navy?" He meant the Netherlands Navy. "No," I said, "ours," meaning the American Navy, of course. His little navy was scattered all over the Germans took Holland. Henrik sat quietly. "Well, our Navy will come too," he said. I didn't want to argue with him. Everybody felt really bad about Holland and how it had been conquered by the Nazis. Then an army officer climbed out of the truck and told us to leave the Queen Emma Bridge. He was very stern and he growled, "Don't you know they could shoot a torpedo up here and kill you? All of you?" He looked out towards the sea again. It was blue and peaceful, and there was a good breeze that churned it up, making the lines of the white caps. The white clouds drifted slowly over it, but I could see the usual parade of ships coming down the harbor. The stubby ones, the massive ones with flags of many nations that steamed slowly up to the bay to the shot gate to load gas and oil. The sea was empty. There was not even a sail on it. We suddenly became frightened, and we ran home to the Shalaro section where we lived. I guess my face was pale when I went into the house because my mother, who was in the kitchen, asked immediately, "Where have you been?" "Punda," I admitted. "I went with Henrik." My mother got very upset. She grabbed my shoulder and shook it. "I told you not to go there, Philip," she said angrily. "We are at war. Do you understand?" "We just wanted to see the submarines," I said. My mother closed her eyes and pulled me up against her thin body. She was like that, 1 minute shaking me, the next minute holding me. The radio was on, and the voice said that 56 men had died on the lake tankers that were blown up, and that the governor of the Netherlands and West Indies had appealed to Washington for help. There was no use in asking Amsterdam. I listened to the sorrowful sound of his voice until my mother's hand switched it off. Finally, she said, "You'll be safe if you do what I tell you, and don't leave the yard again today." She seemed very nervous. But there was often my mother was often nervous. My mother always was afraid I'd fall off a seawall or tumble out of a tree or cut myself with a pocket knife. Henrik's mother wasn't that way. She just laughed a lot and said, boys, boys, boys." Late in the afternoon, my father, whose name is also Philip Enright, returned home from the refinery where he was working on a program to increase the production of aviation gas. He'd been up since 2 o'clock, my mother said, and to please don't ask him too many questions. They had phoned him that morning to say that the Germans might attempt to shell the refinery and the oil storage tanks, and that he must report to help fight fires. I had not seen him so tired, so I didn't ask too many questions. There's not as many as I wanted to. Until this past year, my father and I had done a lot of things together. Fishing, or sailing on small boats, or taking long hikes around Krupp Bay or Cerro Mayo, or just going into the Kanokioke, the countryside, together. He knew a lot about trees and fish and birds, but now he always seemed busy, even on Sunday. He'd shake his head and say, "Sorry, guy, I have to work." After he had put a pint of Dutch cold ale, he had one every night in the living room while he was home, I asked, "Will they shoot at us tonight?" He looked at me gravely and answered, "I don't know, Philip. They might. I want you and your mother to sleep here down here tonight, not on the second floor. I don't think you're in danger, but it's better to sleep down here." "How many of them are out there?" I thought they might be like a school of fish, like a dozen maybe. I wanted to be able to tell Henrik exactly what my father knew about the submarines. He shook his head. "Nobody knows, Philip. But there must be at least 3 of them around the islands. The attacks were in 3 different places." "They came all the way from Germany?" He nodded. "Or from bases in France," he said, loading his pipe. "Why can't we go out and fight them?" I said. My father laughed sadly, tapped his long forefinger on my chest. You'd like that, wouldn't you? But we have nothing to fight 'em with, son. We can't go out on motorboats and attack 'em with rifles. My mother came to the kitchen. Stop asking so many silly questions, Philip. I told you not to do that. Father looked at her strangely. He had always answered my questions. He has a right to know. He's involved here too, Grace. My mother looked back at him. Yes, unfortunately he is, she said. My mother and I knew, had not wanted to come to Caraco. In late 1939, my father had argued that he was needed for the war effort and thought the United States was not at war then. The Royal Dutch Shell had borrowed him from this American company because he was an expert at refineries and gasoline production. But the moment she saw it, my mother decided she didn't like Caraco, and she often complained about the smell of gas and oil whenever the trade winds were down. It was very different in Virginia, where my father had been in charge of building a new refinery on the banks of the Elizabeth River. We lived in a small white house on an acre of land with many trees. My mother often talked about the house and the trees and about the change of the seasons and the friends she had there. She said it was nice and safe in Virginia. My father answered quietly, There's no place nice and safe right now, Grace. I remember the summers with the lightning bugs and the honeysuckle smells and the cold winters when the fields would all be brown and would crackle under my feet. I didn't remember too much else. I was only 9 when we moved to the Caribbean. I guess my mother was homesick for Virginia, where no one talked Dutch and there was no smell, gas or oil, and there were not so many black people around. Now there was cold silence between my mother and father. Lately it had been happening more and more. So she went back to the kitchen. I said to him, Why can't they use aircraft and bomb submarines? He was staring towards the kitchen, and he didn't hear me, so I repeated it. He sighed. Same answer, Philip. There are no fighting aircraft down here. To tell you the truth, we don't have any weapons.